Throughout our lifetimes, few gaming experiences have ever captured the imagination quite like Final Fantasy VII. Its world didn't just feel vast, it felt boundless, brimming with mystery and alive with secrets waiting to be unearthed. Every shadowed alleyway, every mist-laden mountain path, and every flickering light in Midgar seemed to hint at something more, something just out of reach. Due to this, it made us feel like we were only ever scratching the surface of something far greater, and in many ways, we were right. Even decades later, fans are still uncovering new details, hidden dialogues, and fresh interpretations of its rich lore. Final Fantasy VII was never just a game you played, it was a world you became obsessed with, one that made you feel like no matter how deep you dug, there was always more waiting beneath the surface. So, holding such thoughts, join me today as we delve into not just the mysteries we were never meant to uncover, but also the content that was just left behind. Fragments of a grander vision that, for one reason or another, never made it into the final release. From inaccessible areas buried within the game's code to storylines that were cut or altered, Final Fantasy VII holds a treasure trove of secrets that continue to fascinate players decades on. Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is the lost content of the original Final Fantasy VII. Yeah! Like many games released before the internet was as popular and widely used as it is now, Final Fantasy VII is home to many curious moments that sparked a lot of questions, but not a lot of answers. One of these instances relates directly to the foreboding well that we could descend into in the Coral Prison area beneath the Golden Saucer. In a certain version of the game, once you got to the bottom, it could trigger a fight against a mysterious enemy labelled Test Zero, which, when attacked, it eerily exclaimed, "It hurts!" An encounter that would result in urban legends springing up around this combat scenario around the time of the game's release. If you have never owned the Japanese version of the game, it is likely that you have never experienced this battle firsthand yourself, but you may have very well have known about it due to it being referred to in one of the game's unofficial strategy guides. The Final Fantasy VII Unofficial Strategy Guide by Versus Books references the encounter on page 37. According to the guide, players who climb down the well at the start of the Coral Prison level have a very low chance of encountering a strange dog-like creature. It states that these enemies are said to have a massive 25,000 HP each, yet never attack the player, and defeating them supposedly rewards 4,000 XP, 400 AP and 40,000 gil. But this strange little tale doesn't end here. While clearly being a mere debug fight that seems to have accidentally been left in the game, in an awesome moment of fan service referencing this obscure incident, Test Zero would return in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. In Chapter 8 of the game, as part of the retelling of the same story, we descend to the bottom of the very same well, where this time a battle arena is located. If you defeat enough opponents down here, you will once again be treated to a fight against the mysterious Type Zero, which looks just like it did in the original game. Using your accessibility on this enemy, it allows us to discover the opponent's new canon reason for being in the game, with it being listed that it is a test subject that managed to escape from Shinra Research and Development Division due to a developer's oversight. It has since acquired the faculty of speech, however stilted by mindlessly parroting all that it hears. It's deep cuts like this that make me appreciate Final Fantasy VII Rebirth even more, and I am so pleased it has just arrived on PC, so that even more people can enjoy this modern gem. I cannot recommend this one enough. What's even better is that using my affiliate link, I can get you a massive 43% off of both Rebirth and Remake, so there is no better time to play these games for yourself. Grab huge discounts on the majority of the Final Fantasy games, as well as thousands of others, by using my links via the pinned comment. Happy shopping, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this video. On the subject of content that cannot be found in the original final version of Final Fantasy VII, we have this intriguing screenshot. Final Fantasy's 25th anniversary Ultimania, a celebration of the franchise for its 25th anniversary, shares this single solitary image of work being performed to make Final Fantasy VII back when it was still a Super Nintendo project. Borrowing character sprites from Final Fantasy VI, 3 characters are seen in some rustic farmland. Rather than showing characters or a location that was planned to be part of a final game, in all likelihood this was simply artists experimenting with a general graphic design for the title, way before anything truly concrete had been decided upon. Still, an alternative universe where Final Fantasy VII was completed for the Super Nintendo remains an extremely intriguing one. If you know your gaming history, you will also be aware that the Super Nintendo is not the only console on which the 7th mainline entry in this classic JRPG series could have ended up on, as work was also undertaken to prepare for a potential Nintendo 64 or Nintendo 64 disk drive release. Square began experimenting with Final Fantasy VII using early Nintendo 64 dev kits, and even created a tech demo showcasing Final Fantasy VI characters rendered in 3D. However, they quickly ran into massive problems. The biggest problem with developing the title for the Nintendo 64 was the system's cartridge-based storage. N64 cartridges maxed out at 64 megabits, whereas the PlayStation CD held 650 megabits each. And the Final Fantasy VII we ended up getting needed 3 discs, totaling over 1.3 gig. This would have made it impossible to include the pre-rendered backgrounds, FMV cutscenes and high-quality music that would later define the game. To compound issues, cartridges were also far more expensive to manufacture, making large-scale RPGs financially unviable. Additionally, Nintendo's strict control over third-party developers meant Square had limited creative freedom, making the N64 less attractive for ambitious projects. These problems forced Square to pivot to Sony's PlayStation, which offered CD-ROM technology, allowing for large-scale storytelling, cinematic cutscenes and high-quality music without storage constraints. Had Square stuck with the N64, Final Fantasy VII would have been a drastically different and likely inferior game, lacking many of the features that made it revolutionary. And the very fact that they even toyed with this idea presents a very interesting what-if scenario. Of course, the console the game was set to debut on was not the only element that changed throughout the development cycle. The graphical style that was eventually chosen was also up for debate for a period. Early in development, some staff wanted to continue with 2D pre-rendered backgrounds and sprite-based characters, similar to Final Fantasy VI. However, others, including Yoshinori Kitase and producer Horinobu Sakaguchi, pushed for full 3D polygonal models, inspired by advancements in technology and rival RPGs. The PlayStation's capabilities allow for 3D graphics, but rendering an entire JRPG in real-time 3D was impractical given hardware limitations. During the development of Final Fantasy VII, there was an internal faction at Square that preferred a 2D sprite-based character style in a 3D world. One of the key advocates for this approach was Tetsuya Takahashi, who was involved in early concept work for the game before shifting focus to his own project, which eventually became Xenogears, a game that featured the graphical style he vouched for. In Final Fantasy VII though, the push for full 3D models ultimately won out, with key figures believing that polygonal models would better immerse players in the game's cinematic storytelling. Due to the hardware limitations, a pre-rendered background plus 3D characters hybrid approach was chosen to make the world feel detailed while keeping character models flexible. While we cannot witness a version of Final Fantasy VII where the opposite graphical style was chosen due to being left on the cutting room floor, fortunately we can partly imagine what it would have looked like due to Xenogears existing. With that one, Takahashi and his team used 2D sprites for characters, combined with a fully rotatable 3D world, which gave the game a distinct aesthetic that contrasted sharply with Final Fantasy VII's hybrid, chibi and realistic 3D models. Speaking of the two different kinds of character models that can be found within the game, you might instantly assume that they differ so wildly between battling and the rest of the game simply due to limitations. However, there is a further reason that the different models were used, and that reason was visual clarity. Basically, the more realistic models function great in battles due to their proportions, which made combat look more impressive. And the chibi models had large faces, meaning that they were perfect for applying detailed expressions to. As outlined by the cutting room floor, character models feature multiple eye and mouth textures, but most of these remained unused. Typically, only open and closed eye textures appear in gameplay, with rare exceptions like Aerith laughing in Cloud's Dream and Barrett's flashback in Corel Prison. The PC version further limits this, causing inconsistencies such as Aerith's eyes staying open while laughing. Mouth textures are similarly underused, Only Cid and Tifa's are used in single scripted moments, but the PC version removes even these variations. Speaking of the cutting room floor, it also informed me of the no water game shark code. As whether it be the real world or the one featured in Final Fantasy VII, what better way is there to unearth secrets than by draining the sea? The code unlocks a bizarre hidden world lurking beneath the surface. By removing the ocean graphics from the world map, you can walk across the underwater terrain, revealing a glitched out, eerie version of the seabed that was never meant to be explored this way. More interestingly, when you open the menu, it accurately labels your position as the bottom of the sea, a unique name found nowhere else in the game. Whether this was a scrapped feature or a forgotten remnant, it's still cool to find it in the hidden depths. Since we are on the subject of weird locations, there are also multiple unused field maps that can be seen. This strange hill named Trap for unknown purposes, an empty cargo ship, and this long boy image of inside the northern crater. Also, speaking of the prison well which I mentioned earlier in the video, this mysterious location hides yet another bizarre secret. Hidden in the foreground layer of a pre-rendered background in Final Fantasy VII lies a strange little character, completely masked out by the game's code. At first glance, you might think the empty treasure chest nearby was placed there to hide him, but that theory falls apart as the two don't even overlap. So what's the story behind this strange figure? A forgotten NPC? A scrapped event? Or perhaps a cheeky signature left behind by a CG artist? Whatever the case, this odd detail adds yet another mystery to this already infamous location in the game. All this figure needs is his own creepypasta. In fact, there are other locations with lots of questions around them too, such as this one, the ever-alluring inaccessible cave. Deep within the sleeping forest, just before reaching the forgotten capital, there's a ledge that teases this forbidden entrance, complete with a vine that looks climbable. Everything about it screams, this is a path. There's even a side route leading right up to it, but when you try to interact, nothing happens. Pressing select reveals the harsh truth, the exit simply doesn't work. Was this an abandoned shortcut, a scrapped event, or just an environmental detail that ended up looking too inviting? Whatever the reason, it remains one of Final Fantasy VII's most frustrating and mysterious dead ends. On this niche subject, great Final Fantasy channel Last Elixir Productions has recently uploaded a video dedicated to this mystery, breaking down that there is a strong chance that it led to the Ancient Forest, an optional dungeon that is unlocked after defeating the ultimate weapon, which originally may have been intended to function as part of the main quest. But if you want to learn more about this one, I suggest you check out their rather technical video on that very matter. The cut Honeybee Inn content in Final Fantasy VII is one of the most infamous pieces of the unfinished or censored material in the game. While remnants of it remain in the final version, certain scenes and areas were removed or altered, but thanks to hacking, players can still access parts of what was originally planned. The Honeybee Inn is of course the hilarious brothel-like establishment in Wall Market that Cloud visits as part of his cross-dressing quest to infiltrate Don Corneo's mansion. While the area remains in the final game, certain interactions, rooms and dialogue options were cut or altered, but that doesn't mean we can't look at them today. TheLivestream.net provides some great info regarding what transpires in these forbidden rooms, so let's talk about them. The page notes that in the game, the Honeybee Inn is made up of several interconnected rooms, each serving a different purpose. These include the entrance area, the main hub, the dressing room, a customer room shared by the western entrances, and another customer room for the eastern entrances. One of the more unusual design choices is found in the customer room for the eastern entrance, where a second graphical layer is placed over the room to create the illusion of viewing it through a keyhole. Unlike other areas, you're never allowed to explore this space freely, only catching glimpses through this obscured perspective. But from the extensive evidence I've showcased to you today, it clearly illustrates that the Honeybee Inn underwent significant revisions before this final version took shape, with its hexagonal honeycomb layout evolving along the way. The original design of the inn differed drastically from this. Within the Honeybee Inn's unused content, 3 inaccessible rooms stand out: the lobby and waiting room on the first floor and an employee room on the second floor. These areas can only be entered via cheat codes in the original Japanese release, suggesting they were removed before the international versions were finalised. These 3 rooms house many interesting curiosities and dialogue exchanges, so let me run through with you the ones in which I find the most interesting. Firstly, let's discuss the most vibrant out of these 3 seedy locations, the lobby. which, like in many real-life brothels or Japanese soap houses, pictures of various girls hang on the wall like a menu in a restaurant, allowing customers to pick and choose what they are hungry for. If that's not good enough clarification for you, a sign hangs on the wall advertising the lengths of sessions with them, running from 30 to 100 minutes for those with as much stamina as myself. We also see various messages containing innuendo flash up on screen, such as "come into my hive" and "how about some honey?" Because nothing says classy establishment like aggressively bee-themed pickup lines. It's my kind of place. I'm surprised nobody shouted, "Oh, behave." Amusingly, a sheepish Shinra employee can be seen nervously lining up to pay for services, only to be caught in the act by none other than Shinra executive Palmer, who, in a hilarious display of hypocrisy, scolds him for being there. Never mind the fact that Palmer himself is clearly a regular in Honeybee Inn, proving once again that rank has its privileges, and shame is only for the lower rungs of the corporate ladder. As for this scene, it was said to feature the unused track known as Comical, which I will play a sound bite for you from now. It certainly makes Palmer seem a tad more bulk and skull-like, which I guess was the intended purpose for this fat idiot who puts butter in his tea. The waiting room is just as entertaining as the rest of the Honeybee Inn, offering yet another unexpected surprise, a character named Squedge, who appears to be Wedge's far less famous sibling. Whether he was an abandoned NPC, an inside joke, or just a bizarre coincidence, one thing's for sure, he definitely didn't get the same career opportunities as his better-known brother. While Wedge was off fighting for the freedom of Midgar, Squedge seems to have taken a very different path in life, one that apparently involves lounging around a questionable establishment, waiting for his turn at whatever ridiculous experience the Honeybee Inn has to offer. Still, I respect people who book prostitutes a lot more than eco-terrorists, so I'd rather be friends with Squedge. Now here's something cool that might blow your mind. One of the other NPCs who appears to be in the room may very well be, or at least be the character that inspired, Johnny, one of the most amusing characters in Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth. Johnny is that one mate who never quite has his life together but is somehow always around, popping up at the most inconvenient yet hilarious moments. In Remake, he's a loud-mouthed, overly dramatic disaster who gets himself kicked out of the wool market and spends most of his time shouting about how unfair his life is, despite doing absolutely nothing to improve his situation. Johnny's relationship with Tifa is best described as a one-sided, cringe-fueled devotion that she absolutely does not reciprocate. In the waiting room, an NPC can be found who not only suspiciously looks like Johnny, but suspiciously behaves like him too. The NPC shows extreme concern about Cloud's relationship status, concluding that he is heartbroken yet again. The man I'm dubbing Johnny is also responsible for giving Cloud what might be the most infamous cut item in Final Fantasy VII history, the mysterious panties. Clearly meant to be part of Cloud's wool market cross-dressing adventure, this item was left to linger in the game's files, forever raising questions about just how far Square originally planned to take this sequence. While the event itself was scrapped, the mere existence of Johnny handing Cloud a pair of panties is enough to fuel endless speculation, making it one of Final Fantasy VII's most bizarre and hilariously questionable lost treasures. Speaking of lost items, the game only has two more, known as the Letter to a Daughter and the Letter to a Wife. Linking to these, there is an unused conversation in Gongaga for a travelling salesman who asks you to deliver these for him, but the information they contain remains unknown. Also, buried within Final Fantasy VII's code are several unused materia, possibly for testing purposes, though they were only given proper names in the Japanese version. One such example is Booster, a support materia that reaches 5-star max level but has no function, though speculation suggests it was meant to increase AP gain on linked materia. Another oddity is Lore, a command materia that teaches Guild Toss, with an unused matching command in the demo version, hinting at an early cut. M-Barrier, a magic materia, was seemingly meant to provide a magic barrier. The Reflect Absorb materia, which seems tied to a cut battle status of the same name, possibly as a counter to Reflect. An actual Reflect materia, and an Underwater Respiration materia. This one would have allowed players to fight Emerald Weapon without a time limit. Among Final Fantasy VII's unused mechanics is a mysterious status called Jewel, which exists in the game's code but does absolutely nothing. While its intended function remains unknown, some speculate it was meant to resemble Final Fantasy VIII's double status, which allows a character to cast 2 spells per turn. Even stranger than an unused status effect is an entire scrapped element known in official Japanese sources as the 10th element. While this element is still coded into the game, most attacks linked to it deal no damage, making it effectively invisible to players. The only move that still makes full use of it is the ultimate weapon's Ultimate Beam, a devastating attack that can actually be resisted or absorbed if a player pairs a non-elemental materia, like Restore, with an elemental materia in their armour. How bizarre! Among Final Fantasy VII's unused enemy encounters, a few notable monsters were originally intended to appear outside of their final locations. Ho-Chu, a giant plant creature, is normally only fought in the battle square, either in the final round or the second round of the special battle. However, encounter data suggests that it was once meant to appear in the ancient forest, likely as a fixed, inescapable battle. Similarly, Tomberry, another Battle Square exclusive, has an unused encounter in the Whirlwind Maze within Northern Crater. Added to its obscurity, it possesses an almost unused attack called Time Damage, which is so ridiculously difficult to trigger that most players have never seen it in action. The attack criteria: the player must land 3 consecutive attacks in a row requiring haste on the attacker and slow on Tomberry to even have a chance. Beyond enemies themselves, several creatures possess hidden or impossible to use enemy skills. Jewelhorn, a familiar enemy, has a completely broken skill that costs 65,535 MP, an absurd number ensuring it can never be used. Even if it could be triggered, it does no damage and targets a random combatant, friend or foe. In addition to these, we have unfinished mechanics. Final Fantasy VII contains dummied out test enemies buried within the game's 256 battle scene datasets. These test foes were likely used by developers to debug combat mechanics, but their names were never translated or properly encoded for the international versions, so they appear as garbled text when forced into battle. One exception is Scene 249, which can actually be accessed via the Battle 999 debug option, allowing players to fight test encounters that were never meant to be seen. Other than this rare exception, these lost battles remain inaccessible, leaving us to wonder what other scrap mechanics and enemy experiments were left behind within the game's development. In the mid-90s, Square are considering various directions for Final Fantasy VII before deciding on the cyberpunk-inspired Midgar. Among the early ideas, one concept involved a detective investigating a mystery in a modern urban environment, specifically New York City. Given that Final Fantasy had always leaned into fantasy worlds with medieval or steampunk influences, this would have been a radical departure from tradition, a full-blown noir detective story set in the real world. However, as development progressed, Square opted for a dystopian, corporate-controlled setting instead, which led to Midgar and Shinra replacing New York City and its crime-ridden streets. Rather than abandoning the detective premise entirely, Square repurposed it into Parasite Eve, a game that features a New York setting, a gritty supernatural-infused storyline, and a detective-like protagonist, Aya Bree. Speaking of early development of the game's story, the original party lineup was conceptualized as prototypes of Cloud, Barrett and Aerith, forming the core trio that would serve as the foundation for the final game. While their initial designs and roles evolved significantly, the basic dynamic of a determined hero, a hardened warrior, and a kind-hearted woman was established early on. This trio was the starting point of Final Fantasy VII's narrative direction, though their personalities, backstories, and even some design aspects shifted throughout development. The detective, originally known as Joe, would transition to become Cloud, a mercenary, but what for the others? Barrett was originally meant to be much more serious and strategic, resembling Final Fantasy VI's Cyan, a disciplined fighter rather than a loud, emotionally driven rebel. Later, he would be given more of a hot-headed, explosive personality to contrast with Cloud's initially detached attitude. This version of Barrett also played a stronger mentor role early in development, acting as a guiding force for Cloud. Aerith's early character concept was one of the most interesting because she was originally envisioned as a party member who would survive the entire game. In early story drafts, her fate was drastically different, as she was meant to play a larger role in the final battle against Sephiroth. Through development, the idea was floated for a while that she would be Sephiroth's sister, before that plan changed, with the idea instead being that she would be positioned as his former lover. Of course, both of these ideas would be dropped, and instead, when Zack was invented, he would function as her former partner instead. Aerith's death in Final Fantasy VII is one of the most shocking and emotionally powerful moments in gaming history. And it wasn't just for drama, it was a deliberate choice that reinforced the game's themes, character arcs and emotional depth. At the time, RPGs rarely killed off main characters permanently, making Aerith's sudden and irreversible murder by Sephiroth all the more devastating. Producer Horinobu Sakaguchi had also been dealing with personal grief, particularly the loss of his mother, and wanted Final Fantasy VII to explore death in a meaningful way. Aerith's death fundamentally changed Cloud's journey. Her death shatters his emotional walls, turning his battle against Sephiroth from a hired job into a deeply personal vendetta. From a gameplay perspective, it also forces the player to adapt, as many players invested heavily in her healing-based limit breaks, only to suddenly lose her forever. Unlike many RPGs where fallen characters can be revived, Square made sure her death was permanent, making it feel real in a way most games never dared. Beyond storytelling and gameplay, her death was a brilliant subversion of players' expectations. Given her prominent role in the first act and her romantic tension with Cloud, many players assumed she would be the game's central heroine, only for her to be ripped away unexpectedly. This cemented Sephiroth as a truly merciless villain, and ensured that players never felt safe again. Results would have obviously been very different if she was kept alive throughout the game like originally intended. Tifa was added to Final Fantasy VII for several reasons, many of which were directly tied to the decision to kill off Aerith. While Aerith's death served a thematic and narrative purpose, the development team needed another strong female lead to balance the story, provide emotional depth, and offer Cloud a meaningful connection to his past. With Aerith gone, Tifa became the emotional heart of the party, especially in the later game where she helps Cloud rediscover his true self. If Aerith had been the only major female lead, her death might have left the story too bleak, with Cloud completely isolated. By having Tifa step into a stronger supporting role in the latter half of the game, the developers avoided leaving Cloud emotionally adrift, ensuring that the story could continue evolving rather than simply focusing on grief. Speaking of grief and cut ideas, one of the boldest and most extreme concepts considered during Final Fantasy VII's development was to have the entire party die at the end of the game. This would have made the story even darker and more tragic, reinforcing the idea that sacrifices must be made to save the planet. However, while this would have been a shocking and unforgettable ending, it raised concerns among the development team. If everyone died, it could have potentially diminished the emotional impact of Aerith's earlier death, which was meant to be a pivotal turning point in the story. Instead, they left the game's ending open-ended, showing Holy's activation and Meteor's destruction, but leaving the ultimate fate of humanity uncertain. This way, Aerith's sacrifice remained the emotional centerpiece of the story, while the ending still felt impactful without being overwhelmingly bleak. One of the most intriguing cut storylines from Final Fantasy VII revolves around Red 13 and a twisted cloning experiment by Hojo. Originally, after Red 13 was captured by Shinra, Hojo would have created multiple clones of him, two of which named Cobalt 14 and Indigo 15, who were designed to be blue and purple third versions of the original. These clones were meant to be unnatural, forced creations, acting as both failed experiments and tragic figures to Red 13's personal arc. The scrapped subplot would have led to an intense identity crisis for Red 13, culminating in a boss battle against his own duplicates. After the battle, Red 13 would urge the party to spare them, recognising that even though they were created in a lab, they were still the last of his kind beyond himself. Unfortunately, this entire subplot was cut from the Final Fantasy game, leaving Cobalt 14 and Indigo 15 as nothing more than a lost piece of Final Fantasy VII history. Yuffie was originally conceived as a 25-year-old ex-soldier turned bounty hunter, relentlessly tracking both Cloud and Sephiroth while also being hunted herself. The developers originally wanted posters featuring her stats to be scattered across the world, adding an interactive twist to her recruitment. Depending on which poster the player last inspected before encountering her, Yuffie's age, appearance, stats, abilities and even level would change, making her even more dynamic and unpredictable. This mechanic would have given each player a unique version of Yuffie, reinforcing her elusive and dangerous nature, far removed from the cheeky, materia-obsessed ninja she ultimately became. According to the Final Fantasy VII Ultimania Omega, Vincent's character went through multiple transformations during development, evolving from a horror researcher to a chemist, then a detective, before finally becoming a former Turk. His design also saw significant changes. Early Tetsuya Nomura concept art even depicted him wielding a scythe instead of his signature handgun, hinting at a more Grim Reaper-like aesthetic before his final vampiric gunslinger persona was established. Both Yuffie and Vincent came dangerously close to being scrapped from Final Fantasy VII due to time constraints, but thanks to Tetsuya Nomura and Yoshinori Kitase, they were saved at the last minute, albeit as optional characters. Vincent's brooding backstory and mystique likely made him too compelling to cut, but Yuffie's survival was largely due to one person's passion, event planner Jun Akiyama, who had a strong personal attachment to her character. Determined to give her more presence, Akiyama pushed for additional cutscenes and character moments, even coming up with the idea of her ambushing the party and the playful scene that follows. As development progressed, Yuffie's role kept expanding, proving that sometimes a single dedicated developer can make all the difference in ensuring a character makes it into gaming history. Early drafts of Final Fantasy VII painted a very different picture of the game's central mystery, as detailed in Final Fantasy VII's Ultimania Omega. Originally, the story was far more explicit in showing that the party wasn't truly chasing Sephiroth, they were pursuing Jenova all along. One scrap scene on the cargo ship had Sephiroth dramatically unfurling his cape to unleash a severed piece of Jenova, specifically its hand, onto the party. Even more unsettling, the Black Capes, supposedly fouled Sephiroth clones, were not people at all in this version. Instead, they were floating fragments of Jenova itself, shrouded in cloaks to imitate human forms. Each fragment had its own designation, such as a hand, thumb, or heart, which explains why Cloud refers to Jenova Birth as the arm of Jenova. The game was also planned to feature 2 additional boss fights against these living remnants, one between Cosmo Canyon and Nibelheim and another inside the Temple of the Ancients. Another fascinating concept from the early script suggests that there wasn't a group of Black Capes, but rather a single entity Jenova, shedding pieces of itself as it moved closer to Sephiroth. This idea would have culminated in the Whirlwind Maze, where the party would finally catch up to the elusive Black Cape. Instead of revealing another clone, the hood would fall away to reveal an empty void where a face should have been. Then the cloak itself would drop, exposing only Jenova's heart, the final remaining fragment, which would then transform into a monstrous entity for one last confrontation. Even more intriguingly, early design documents indicate that Jenova was not initially conceived as an alien form. Instead, it was meant to be a hidden aspect of human genetics or brain function. The name Jenova was said to originate from an ancient Cetra text, sometimes called the Book of God, and other times the Book of the Devil. This book supposedly contained forbidden knowledge about the deepest mysteries of human consciousness. The Jenova factor was something that could either awaken naturally in rare individuals or be artificially triggered through exposure to Mako energy. In this version of the story, materia acted as a conduit, unlocking dormant abilities linked to Jenova's influence. The concept of Jenova as a mental or genetic phenomenon was eventually repurposed in Parasite Eve and Xenogears, 2 other titles developed by Square that explored similar themes of biological evolution and consciousness. Edea from Final Fantasy VIII was originally conceived during the development of Final Fantasy VII, with Tetsuya Nomura designing her to reflect the ethereal and elegant aesthetic often seen in Yoshitaka Amano's artwork. Her regal, flowing robes, intricate headpiece, and otherworldly beauty were all inspired by Amano's signature style. However, the concept ultimately went unused in Final Fantasy VII, as the game's cyberpunk-inspired setting and narrative direction didn't provide a natural place for such a character. It was Final Fantasy VIII, a game that fully embraced themes of sorcery, fate, and aristocratic mysticism, that Nomura found the perfect opportunity to bring Edea to life. Her gothic yet elegant design was refined to make her a commanding and visually striking presence, blending elements of high fashion, dark fantasy, and supernatural mystique, but it's always worth remembering that she is only in such a game due to being cut from Final Fantasy VII. Early drafts of Final Fantasy VII painted a far more twisted and volatile version of Sephiroth as well, one where his descent into madness was driven not just by revelation about his origins, but by something even more insidious: Mako addiction. That's right, originally his Jenova element wasn't simply inherited, it was artificially awakened through excessive exposure to Mako energy. They essentially at one point planned for him to be a drug addict. His addiction would have fueled his madness, heightening his delusions of superiority and deepening his obsession with destruction. Another scrapped idea would have given Sephiroth even greater psychological control over Cloud. In this version, Sephiroth wouldn't just manipulate Cloud through visions and implanted memories, he would convince Cloud that he had personally created him. This deception would further unravel Cloud's fragile sense of self, making him even more vulnerable to Sephiroth's influence. One of the more surprising early concepts of Final Fantasy VII was that Sephiroth was at one point planned to be a female. While details on this idea are scarce, it's known that during the game's initial development, the team experimented with making the main villain a woman, potentially changing the dynamic between Sephiroth and the other characters. This scrapped concept likely stemmed from early ideas about Jenova's influence, as the game's lore deeply intertwines themes of motherhood, genetic inheritance, and manipulation. If Sephiroth had been female, the connection to Jenova as a mother figure could have been even more direct, possibly making the character a more explicit chosen heir rather than a rebellious creation. Ultimately, the idea was scrapped, and the team settled on the silver-haired, imposing warrior we know today. However, the concept of a powerful female antagonist with deep ties to an ancient godlike force would later resurface in Final Fantasy VIII with Ultimecia, who shares some thematic similarities to what a female Sephiroth might have been. But let me ask you, who wants to be stepped on by a female Sephiroth? I mean, let's be real here, the internet has proven time and time again that there's an audience for tall, imposing women with god complexes. If Lady Sephiroth had made it into the final game, she probably would have single-handedly kickstarted an entire Final Fantasy subgenre of mummydom villains. Can you imagine how unhinged the fanbase would be? We'd have Sephiroth cosplays with 6-inch stilettos, sultry One-Winged Angel remixes, and a million questionable fanfics where she re-educates Cloud for his insubordination. Twitter, or whatever it's called now, would be on fire with people thirsting over their beloved Dark Goddess. Square Enix probably dodged a bullet or missed a marketing goldmine when they decided to keep Sephiroth as a cold, brooding pretty boy we all know and fear. But let's be honest, the world simply wasn't ready for her. Wow, this video ended up being a lot longer than expected. So if you're still here, you must really love Final Fantasy VII. Don't forget that using my affiliate link, I can get you a massive 43% off of both Rebirth and Remake, so there is no better time to play these games yourself. Grab huge discounts on the majority of Final Fantasy games, as well as thousands of others by using my links via the pinned comment. Happy shopping, and I'll see you all again soon. Cheerio!